Okay. The video is restricted. Welcome to Shareholders of a Better World, brought to you by TBLI Group. At TBLI Group, we have an established reputation as an organization dedicated to building the ecosystem of global sustainability and impact investing. We're doing this through educating, advising, and facilitating transactions in global sustainability and impact business, as well as capital solutions for private companies, family offices, and fund groups. For nearly 25 years, TBLI Group has created a vertically integrated ecosystem of education to action through TBLI conferences and TBLI consulting. More about our company can be found at tbligroup.com. This webinar is brought to you by TBLI Foundation, which hosts educational learning experiences dedicated to a better planet. Through the foundation, we build sustainable communities by sharing the people and the experiences making a difference to so many of our lives around the world. Our weekly podcasts bring impact thought leaders that are doing and not only chatting. Now let me introduce my guest today. Okay. Welcome to our studio in Amsterdam, TBLI webinar, Shareholders of a Better World. I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to wish Zolt, Joyce, Jaswant, Bill from Brooklyn, Monica, Renee, Kayetan, Shaya, David, Irene, Paula, Glenn, we can't seem to tear you away from our webinars, Sarah and Arthur, welcome to our special webinar on ESG engagement. We're extremely lucky today. We have two global experts on engagement, and we will cover a variety of topics. How does it work? What are the goals of engagement? Is engagement effective? And how do you know when it's successful? Our two speakers are Sachi Suzuku and Peter van der Werff. I'll start with Sachi. If you can briefly tell us a little bit of who you are, what you do, and what is the strategy of Hermes in this case with respect to engagement, and then Peter from Robeco will fill in on his side.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Sachi Suzuku. I work for EOS at Federated Hermes. So Hermes, we recently changed our name to Federated Hermes after majority was acquired by the Federated Investors in the US a couple of years ago. And within the asset management business, EOS team I work in, it's a slightly uniquely positioned in that we don't own a fund. We don't invest in funds directly ourselves, but we focus on stewardship activities and engagement with companies, and also proxy voting advisory as well. And we have own clients externally. So we do work obviously with in-house fund managers, but we have other institutional clients, mainly pension funds and other asset owners globally. And we have about total assets under advice over $1 trillion at the moment. So, and we have a big team in London, and we're also growing a team in North America at the moment. And our main job, as I said, is stewardship activities. So we engage with companies where our clients invest in, and aim to improve their long-term sustainable value, and focusing on long-term value creation. And so in that we talk about long-term business strategy, but we also often focus on corporate governance, environment, social issues. And we have regional language experts. We have some sector experts. themes experts. And my own responsibility is mainly engagement and strategic activities in Japan, but I've also covered other Asian and global markets as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Sachi. Peter, tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at Robeco with respect to engagement.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, so I'm Peter Vanderwerff, a senior engagement specialist, and I'm leading the engagement efforts in Robeco's active ownership team. We focus on a very broad range of environmental, social, and governance topics. Myself, I have a background in agribusiness, and I've been responsible for the last 9 years for the consumer staples sector, where I have a lot of sector knowledge and expertise. But I'm also responsible for healthcare and for some of the chemical companies that are related to food production when it comes to agrochemicals. So these are the three sectors where I've spent most of my time in engagement. So then you're looking at topics like supply chain management, human rights, labor standards, but deforestation and biodiversity is a topic which I'm spending a lot of time on with research at the moment. And beyond that, we look at broader topics of climate change, where we have several experts in our environmental side of the team. We have experts on corporate governance, both in emerging markets and in developed markets. And what I think is unique for Robeco is that we undertake active ownership from the perspective of a fully integrated asset manager model. So we work very closely on a day-to-day basis with our investment specialist, which ensures that our work is always fully focused on financial materiality and on how we bridge those sort of often delicate balance between shorter term impact on profitability of companies versus longer term global macro impacts. When you look at biodiversity loss, for instance, where there is a very clear tension between those two, and how to bridge that and how to bring that into long-term value creation discussions with companies is really what our team focuses on. Next to our team, we have a team of sustainability investing research analysts based at Robeco SAM in Zurich, which is sort of our sister team. We work very closely with them. And together with these two sustainability teams, we advise our investment teams and our clients on progress, on engagement, on sustainability credential of companies, and how that ultimately also affects our investment decisions, where our analysts and PMs take on board all of that sustainability information. And I'm happy to share some of our engagement experience with you today, and take any questions as you have on the effectiveness of engagement.
Thank you. This is a question for both of you. Correct me if I'm wrong. The vast majority of institutional investors or investors in general that use engagement are mainly pension funds, insurance companies, not so much family offices. Is that true?
Yeah, happy to take that question. So on our side, we see that there is a certain need for scale to be able to work with a party like Robeco or others in terms of creating a full program on active ownership, both in terms of voting for all of your equity positions, but also for engagement based on your equity and your credit positions on the side of fixed income. So sort of that required scale in terms of sort of minimum size of assets often brings really the institutional investors to us as clients that are most interested in working very closely with us in a partnership to develop active ownership also on behalf of their assets.
Sachi, what is the main reason that institutional investors choose engagement? Is it just because, well, we don't have to change anything? We can now say that we are doing responsible investment, but we don't have to divest at all. So what is their driver? Is it to have a badge to show I'm doing something? Or is it really fundamentally to change the behavior of the company?
I think To be honest, there are probably different kinds of investors for with different goals, but vast majority really believe in the effectiveness of engagement, and we have seen major change in corporate behaviors through engagement that we do and other investors do collectively also. And well, the ultimate owner of those companies that we engage with are individuals, often retired pensioners and people like ourselves who want to eventually live without concerns about future. Then the institutional investors have the responsibility to really try and change the behavior of large corporates or small ones as well, but to be able to sustain a business, as one of you mentioned earlier, to be profitable on one side, but also be beneficial and sustainable in terms of environment and social aspects.
Peter, do most of the clients that engage Robeco, are they driven by the same passion? Because I've known you for a while and know that you're very passionate about this. Are they driven by the same passion to change the behavior of the company, or is it just a box ticking exercise for them?
Yeah, I would say there is a range of client expectations when it comes to the impact which they have, and also the reason for engaging in responsible investment to begin with. So for a lot of clients, the first step is really getting questions from their beneficiaries when it comes to a pension fund, or when it getting critical questions from journalists or NGOs in terms of why do you have certain positions in your portfolio, and does that reflect also sort of the broader set of values that your beneficiaries share. So I think that's a reason why some investors start to embark on this journey on more sustainability investing. At the same time, we also see that there is often a growth in awareness of these topics that continues also to set or to raise the bar for clients in terms of where they want to move. So some of them start with a very small set of activities that they would like us to undertake and expand that to a broader portfolio. Others really sort of start with a minimum step and then really move that into a much broader set of sometimes investment restrictions combined with specific engagement, focus, and preference which they provide to us. And I think that's also, we organize a client panel every year to get input from clients on where they see the biggest need for engagement and what type of topics we should be developing for our research agenda for the year after, which then develops into a 3-year engagement program. And that is really where we find that over the years, clients are getting more sophisticated, have a more specifically defined preference, which also really then reflects what they're hearing back from their beneficiaries. And I think that is a development that we strongly support, and where Robeco also puts a lot of effort in educating our clients on really the business case and the benefits for sustainability integration, and why we've really brought that into our asset management model already from an early day on.
But this is a question actually for both of you. Because I remember the engagement with the old Standard Oil company, which became ExxonMobil, by the family that actually started at the Rockefellers, and they were never able to really get them to change behavior toward more of a fuel-free or renewable energy focus. So how do you engage along a subject like that when the company is financially doing actually very well? They're making money, they don't have many accidents, they have good health and safety, they treat their staff really well, and you're trying to get them to decarbonize. So how do you approach that? Because, I mean, even the Rockefellers didn't get very far.
I think that's really a question of sort of having also the patience to really embark on a long relationship of engagement with a company. So we have the example of Shell, for instance, where we've spent the last 10 years in a very intensive dialogue in many different topics, from the issues they had initially in Nigeria to decarbonization of their business and their assets, to now also in the past 2 years having issued a joint statement with a couple of investors, with Church of England, APG, and others in the US, together with Robeco and Shell, on behalf of Climate Action 100 Plus, to really come with very detailed commitments that initially was an ambition that grew into shorter term targets based on the feedback that we gave them, with a link to sort of the ESG metrics in remuneration of their board of directors, to really make it very tangible that these results need to be taken. And now up to the point where Shell this year again has further sharpened their targets, and also really clearly now speaking out for a transition, an energy transition, where they need to be working together with their clients, with the sectors that they're serving, in making those steps. And I think that is where we see that 10 years ago, when we had these discussions on climate change with a company like Shell, it was also very difficult to really get them to commit to targets. And now, come 2020, we're at the point where we really see that the company is realizing that it really fundamentally also needs to change its business model to really be, as you also already pointed out, Robert, ready for that longer term future where renewables play a very different role in the energy mix than say 10 or 20 years ago. And from what we've seen in the past years, this example that we've set with Shell, and also that other investors have also pushed other oil majors for, is now following suit, also with some of the US oil majors that are looking at these developments. They're not going that fast, but they are really also making the first steps. Where a couple of years ago, similar to what you mentioned, the Rockefeller family tried, we've seen very little movement, very little willingness to really make steps. That is changing, and I think the global acceptance of the climate change emergency, which we're finding ourselves in, and the need to meet the Paris Agreement reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, is, I think, very clearly and broadly understood. And I think that is where we now see that our engagement and the work we've done for a long time is really starting to bear fruit.
So, Sachi, I had two questions. I want to continue with you about this issue that if a company is not actually doing what the shareholders want, but he's generating financial returns, can you actually get their attention? Because listen, we're performing, we're giving you returns. That's a question one, and a kind of continuation of what Peter was saying. And secondly, I remember when TBLI started years ago, we spoke to various engagement companies, and they were all saying that every time they tried to engage with Japanese companies at that time, they were accused of basically blackmailing the company because they thought they were the Yakuza trying to shake them down. So if you could address, one, how do you deal with a changing behavior of a company that is doing financially well and you're trying to engage? And secondly, the cultural difference between Japan, maybe it's changed a lot now, I'm sure it has, with respect to engagement.
The company is only really interested in making money. I think a lot of companies have changed from that sort of thinking now, but I have had some cases like that, and we're doing financially well, and look at the other company that's supposedly in a doing well, and like governance reform, they are not making as much money. But then with those companies, I think it helps sometimes to explain they bring in the financial rational reasoning for working to tackle climate change. So not just obviously to just push. Why to explain the basics of why we want companies to change. The company needs to change. to reduce, future costs financially, and potential regulations coming in, carbon tax, and so all the financial implications of not doing these things. Even we can say the same thing about social issues like labor rights. If you don't manage labor risk properly, don't address treat your workers or supply chain workers properly, what would happen is that supply chain disruption or major strikes that leads to suspension of production. We have actually seen those cases of big violent strikes. That these are extreme cases, but these can have financial implications, and that might be one way to get these companies moving if they're really only interested in thinking about money or making profits. And to your question about Japanese companies, I think yes, a lot of companies were very skeptical and still are to some extent about especially foreign investors, because there were cases in the past where some activists tried to take over Japanese companies, and the way they did it was quite aggressive, maybe. But we need to actually go back to more fundamental, almost cultural difference, where I think shareholders, the importance of shareholders was not recognized in Japan as much as in many other countries. And we talk about too much of shareholder primacy in the Western markets these days, but I think in Japan it was almost the opposite, major lack of recognition and appreciation of shareholder rights and how to address shareholder interests for a long time. And it only really started to kick off a few years ago when they, I think, with the government commissioned Ito report came in, that those kind of followed on a K review in the UK, and Japan introduced a stewardship code and a corporate governance code, and all these regulatory changes, and also I think increasing the global nature of financial markets, and a lot of companies being exposed to international investors who want to engage. And they have now, many of them have now come to understand that not all investors are aggressive, and in fact many long-term investors are genuinely interested in having constructive dialogue and making positive changes to companies.
Just a quick question. This week, the bonus for KLM Air France was approved by the overall vast majority of all shareholders, except the French state and the Dutch government. Did you vote to increase their bonuses?
Oh, I need to check that. Sorry, I can't answer that question. I need to check with my colleague and come back to you.
Okay, here's a kind of unusual question. I'm sure the answer is no. Have you ever had a institutional investor that said, we want you to engage with large corporates that are not paying taxes, that are doing everything they can to pay no taxes, and we want them to start paying taxes? Have you ever had an engagement request like that, Peter or Sachi?
Yes,
Yeah,
we oh,
go ahead, Sachi.
I can see Peter. So yes, we have engaged on this type of topic, and we have asked companies to publish, first of all, policy on tax policy, and then just commit to paying tax in proportion to the revenues that they derive globally. So not paying a lot of tax in a country where corporate tax is very low, and essentially paying very little when you're deriving a lot of revenues from high tax companies. market. Sorry, Peter.
And Peter,
Yeah.
Peter, did you also get? I'd be really curious to know that an institutional investor is actually asked to do something about that.
Well, that would surprise you, Robert. We've also had a 3-year engagement program on tax transparency, asking companies indeed to commit to being public on the tax principles that they're following, given the nature that it's often very sort of sensitive to be more specific. We've seen some good examples of companies reporting in the best case country by country tax payments, if not region by region, to make it a little bit less easy for competitors to find sort of what has been the income on a per country basis. But we've made good progress with some of the companies where we spoke in that theme. We have to say that with some of the other companies, these were, let's say, tougher discussions where it was not as easy to get the full recognition from these companies that they would need to move, and that they actually indeed pointed at sort of opposing demands from other shareholders that were actually asking for a lower tax base. But from our perspective, it is really important to see that companies need to be able to also sort of be prepared for a future tax regulation that might be stricter than the current tax base, and therefore not incurring additional costs at a future moment, and therefore be prepared for this type of both regulatory demands in terms of transparency, but also in terms of the actual cost of paying taxes. So from that perspective, we saw a lot of support from our investors internally, also in getting more information on taxes, and also getting to a sort of a responsible level of tax payments, which obviously is a fine line between paying too much taxes and at the same time really evading taxes, where companies can have a very aggressive tax policy or a more conservative, and we would prefer companies with a more prudent and a more conservative approach to tax planning.
That's great. How do you know when you're successful? Because these engagement processes take years, sometimes 3 years, 5 years. So you need investors that are really willing to be very, very patient. How do you know when you're successful? Is it based on, have you increased the share price? Have you reduced fines? Have they gotten rid of the toxic companies? What are the guidelines for knowing when we did our job?
I think, well, it depends on the issues that you engage on. But when we engage with companies, we set up objectives, specific objectives at each company we engage with. And it can be multiple. They can have 5 or 7 objectives where companies, we think the companies need to improve a lot of things. So these objectives, we try to make it very specific, and then so what we call SMART, so measurable and easily achievable as well. Not easily achievable, understandable, but not to be overly ambitious as well, because it can take forever, as you say, and we will lose track. So we try to set them sensibly, stretching but not too overly ambitious targets. And then once we complete the objective, then we set a new objective. And within that objective, we split the stages into 1, 2, 3, 4, and we measure our progress and report the level of progress to clients. So objectives can be about very specific thing about climate change. It can be about human rights or other risk management type.
Peter?
Yeah, from our side, very similar approach indeed in setting very clearly measurable targets at the start of our engagement. We always conduct a baseline research program, and we have 4 or 5 of those each year, which means that we have a group of investment analysts, sustainability analysts, conducting interviews with experts in the industry and others to really find what is sort of the baseline for the issues, what are the drivers, what are the systemic challenges, and how do we overcome that through engagement and through pushing companies on the right buttons to improve. And then in terms of measurement, it can be sometimes as simple as having a proper policy for, let's say, a supplier code of conduct, which the company didn't have, or having other types of policies that really show that the company has committed to certain issues. That's something that is very open and public. It can also, in some cases, be more of an understanding how the company is reshaping its risk management systems to a level and a quality that we're satisfied with. And that sometimes comes more out of the conversations we have with companies than with very specific pieces of evidence that they are able to show for, as some of them are internal and therefore not able to be shared with investors. But based on that process, we measure over time and report to our investment teams and our clients how the progress of the companies against these first set objectives is moving. And I think what is very important there is that our baseline research always looks for a peer group so that we can compare companies within a subsector or with similar business mix against each other. And we can, in some cases, also use one company as a best practice example for others, which often really sort of lifts the quality of the whole peer group if they start making progress against that best practice example. So that is really a way how we structure our engagement and also ensure the right quality of our outcomes.
Okay, well, I'm going to start taking questions from the audience. So Jolt, I think I'm pronouncing it right, he wanted to know whether and how to use a sustainable infrastructure standard for ESG engagement, and have you done that in the past?
Yeah, from our side, we haven't spend a lot of time specifically on infrastructure, as that often, in terms of financing and also in terms of sort of project owners, isn't very closely related to specific corporates we might invest in, except those that are sort of undertaking part of an infrastructure project on sort of a construction basis. What I would say in terms of using such an index, these type of external benchmarks are very important. So when I relate to the work that I do on soft commodities, for instance, things like the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, but also issues like the Access to Medicine Index or the Access to Nutrition Index are very important research benchmarks that really help us to track progress of companies, and also are often organizations where the companies engage with a lot on the methodology. So that really makes it easier. In real estate, we use GRESB, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark, as a way of measuring the performance year on year of companies. At Robeco, we work with our colleagues at Robeco SAM also on the Robeco SAM research, which is based on the corporate sustainability assessment. It's now managed by S&P Global, as we've transferred that ESG ratings team in early 2020. But we're still working very closely with them in also getting our own benchmark. So that is something that we use throughout our investments and our engagement, is the information that comes from such a broad index. And these results are used for the Dow Jones Sustainability Index.
Sachi, I'm going to pose this next question. What is your experience with landscape approaches to climate change? How enterprises adopting ESG concepts move from applying these to their own activities to communities they're working in? Do you have any experience with that as an engagement policy?
Sorry, I couldn't hear your question. Can you repeat?
So, sure. What is your experience with landscape approaches to climate change? How enterprises adopting ESG concepts move from applying these to their own activities to communities they are working within?
Okay. So when about the sorry, more broadly, not just about their own operations, but to address indigenous rights, that sort of thing. Is that the point?
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah.
Peter, did you have any comment for this question regarding a landscape approaches? Otherwise, I'll move to the
Yeah,
next one.
happy to step in. So
Sorry.
no problem. Yeah, so I've been doing quite a bit of work on the landscape approach of jurisdictional approach when it comes to palm oil. So where we see that sourcing from a specific group of smallholder producers, for instance, and then trying to get those to a higher sustainability level doesn't really work if the rest of the landscape isn't sort of going along in the same developments. So that's where also within the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, there's now quite a bit of attention to get a full landscape, which is often delineated by a certain region or a certain municipality, to get those certified against a higher sustainability standard. So from that perspective, in palm oil, that is something we're working with, and we're supporting where it's effective. There is obviously a strong dependence also on sort of the institutional quality of the government that is involved, and that is not always as easy as focusing on sort of the direct supplier and off-taker relationship that companies would have when sourcing and focusing on their supply chain. So it brings additional complexity, but at the same time, it's an important measure. And also when you look at climate, when you look at other topics, it is very important also on the side of biodiversity to really look for sort of more of a landscape approach than only individual supply chains of companies.
It's a question about boards and remuneration. One issue that I have observed during the proxy season has been the directors' compensation policies continue to encourage attendance fees. In a post-COVID era, we need to safeguard the diversity of the board, and a special dedication for an adjustment of the companies will be required. Most remuneration schemes drop fees by 1/2 or 1/3 for attending by telematic means. What is your stake on that? How do we retain good talent on the boards, protect diversity, promote responsibility and health, and paying less? Sachi, could you take that question?
Post-COVID. So we are engaging with global companies and diversity, and also remuneration policy, and we long engaged on linking performance with pay properly, but it seems that I think it doesn't seem to work for some reason, and the volume keeps growing exponentially, and so we now asking that the fundamental review of the pay scheme and also more simplify the scheme to suppress excessive risk taking, and also just to be able to for shareholders to see what's coming in advance, and then also, but then we shouldn't really then we need to somehow stop this kind of competition between companies to just keep raising and attract talents just by the increasing pay, and it's quite difficult. I think it's a cultural issue, and interestingly, I think in many Asian countries we haven't seen that sort of behavior. So we're trying to almost have a global view and encourage more sort of wider holistic view of pay scheme, if that makes sense.
Peter, I have a question. Actually, for both of you, but for Peter.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your favorite failure? Was that you were engaging Madoff to be more transparent about his company?
Yeah, I think in terms of a favorite failure, what I've seen within sort of the development of responsible investment is that a lot of focus in certain cases really was on what are the sort of issues, the societal issues that need to be that need to be changed, and I think that's at least one of the personal failures that I've found in the early days of my work, coming out of sort of sustainable development companies, coming out of a background in agricultural and environmental sciences research at Wageningen University, with sort of a very strong focus on what needs to be changed to get to a healthier supply chain, where biodiversity, for instance, is protected, and coming with that message to a corporate that is running with all of the sort of demands and tensions, and the economic reality doesn't always yield the right results, because you're not speaking the same language. So I think that is to me, my favorite failure has been in the early days to come with a different language to a company, and then within 15 minutes the call is over, because you're not finding a common ground to then build on top of that and create that awareness. So I think that's where we as a team have really invested in speaking the same language as our investors, and as sort of the corporate reality is, in terms of sharing both that perspective on creating shareholder value, while at the same time we bring a critical voice on how that can be done in the most sustainable way. So I think that's what I've learned the most from one of my early failures on the engagement side.
Sachi, what was your favorite failure? Or you've
Failure.
only had success?
No, of course not. I think well, failure, yeah, maybe it's actually failure and success at the same company almost. It's yeah, well, I think we can talk about this. So the famous case of Nissan, we had a big scandal. We saw a big scandal a couple of years ago, where the Carlos Ghosn was arrested, and so that a lot of things happened after. We had a long engagement with a company beginning, I think, in 2011. And we had spotted that there's several governance problems there, that the board was not independent. There was no independence at all. There was one outsider, but coming from the large shareholder Renault, and the chair and the CEO were, the position was combined, and the remuneration level for the CEO chair was very high, and the problem that led to Carlos Ghosn leaving the company but getting arrested was that even on top of that high pay, there was allegedly a lot of hidden financial problems, not problems, how he was benefiting outside those pays, but we thought that his pay was seems a bit excessive compared to his peers, and also the very poor disclosure on pay, no breakdown details of how the pay was determined. So we engaged on those issues for a long time, and we tried various methods, meeting at the headquarters, calls, letters to the board, and we also got a few investors together to write a letter to the board as well. And then we finally saw some change to the board. They appointed two independent directors finally, but at around the same time, we also kind of gave up. I would say it could be a failure on pursuing more better disclosure on pay, because it wasn't just going anywhere. But then, so that again, then after the independent directors were appointed, just after that, the scandal happened. So it was quite interesting that that we, in a way that we had spotted these problems early on. But then, I would like to think that if the company had adopted all these measures earlier, then perhaps possibly the problems might have been prevented or at least found earlier. So it's both success and a failure in a way.
Okay, thank you. We have now an awful lot of questions coming in. So what I'll do is I'll ask each question to one person and then switch to the other to try to get through them all. Other than clients, does SASB dictate topics of engagement, or do issues stem mostly from collaborative discussions? For instance, what have some areas of engagement been for the likes of more diversified business models like Danone or Nestle? Peter?
Yeah, so for these type of companies, we're looking at issues like single-use plastic, which is a topic I've done research on last year and engaging now with a broad group of companies. Supply chain management. We're looking at issues of palm oil, but also animal protein or sustainable protein, and how companies are moving in that field as it relates to both the climate, but also the health and the social impacts of the meat and fish industry. So there is a huge number of topics that apply to these broad, diversified food businesses.
Okay, Sachi, next question. I understand one can bring the rationale for changing whilst making money, for example, climate change. But what if the companies still have great prospects without changing behavior? Because let's say the sustainability issue is not understood or there is little pressure. Can you do anything there?
Yes, like I said, I think yes, to address climate change in the long term, the companies may have to make short-term investment that might not look, immediately on the immediate short-term results, but then for long-term, that will save companies from facing huge costs, either through tax or just not being able to run business the way they were used to before because of regulation or just sheer the change in the environment.
Question regarding the bonus package for the CEOs of Air France KLM. I'm shocked by the news from Robert on increased remuneration of the board. This coincides with the bailout in which there is a welcome climate conditionality, reducing emissions, mostly by means of closing short routes that can be replaced by train travel shorter than 2.5 hours. Do you anticipate any shareholder propose to link this goal, a condition of the bailout, to executive pay? Peter?
Yeah, so as sort of a relation to the COVID-19 crisis, we've been having a lot of discussions internally on how to look at these topics of companies that are receiving government bailouts, how they should move ahead with remuneration of their top executives, how they should, on the one hand, keep the right talent on board and also keep them remunerated for their work, versus obviously the larger cost that society with the bailout has to pay, that their employees often also in the case of airlines have to bear in terms of layoffs, of furlough system schemes where they're part of. So all of these things really drive us to make sort of really company by company assessments, where again I think financial prudence and also the right capital allocation decisions are really important. And I think that's something that speaks more broadly to the crisis that we're in now, and that happens with every crisis, is that the companies that are hurt most and that are in the biggest trouble are also those that often weren't prepared to weather a crisis the year before, who were sort of really having a balance sheet that wasn't prepared to weather a crisis, and therefore ultimately weren't able to meet it. So from that perspective, yeah, looking very critically at any remuneration proposal where we feel that these factors aren't in balance, and that's something that we have a voting team of 3 dedicated analysts that are going through all of these items, especially if it's more contentious meetings. We spend a lot of time in analyzing. We have a remuneration framework with 40 different indicators that we test a remuneration proposal against, in terms of balance of metrics, in terms of how all of the different stakeholders are supported. And if a proposal fails in one of these, we will vote again. So we actually have quite a significant percentage of remuneration proposals where we will vote against based on the failure of one of these critical indicators in our assessment framework.
Thank you. Sachi, Claudia wants to know, what is your take on ESG engagement with activist hedge funds? And in addition, what is your policy when ESG engagement with a company fails? You know, how do you move on from there? How do you deal with that?
We, as I said, that we use this milestone objective system, and we will know clearly when we kind of decide to discontinue the objectives. So we do say, okay, let's not put more, any more effort on this topic because it's not the best use of our resource, a client's resource. Then we will, switch a topic. Perhaps let's find another topic that has more feasibility of success and equally important. And then that's how we kind of keep rolling, going with that one company. And we typically try to spend about 2 to 3 years on one topic, between starting engagement and finishing one topic as a one objective. So we, on the same topic, we might set a higher bar, higher threshold, and then keep asking for more.
Okay, Peter, a question from Bhaskar. ESG and landscape investments are 2 sides of the same coin. How can we integrate them with the KPIs, and what are the defined KPIs specific to food and agricultural projects?
Yeah, so to make that a KPI that is applicable to all companies we invest in is quite challenging, because a lot of these projects really have a lot of dynamics on a local scale that really pertain to the specific supply chain and the specific activities for that soft commodity which we're talking about. So it's a challenge when you think about, how do I measure this for my whole staple sector, to bring that into a specific KPI. So from our perspective, when we find these challenging topics, we often start with engagement as a first step in bringing that into our assessment framework, because then you have a peer group where you can do dedicated research, you can have longer term discussions with companies and really explore how they can improve their application of such a methodology, for instance, a landscape approach or jurisdictional approach. And only when we find that there is sufficient commonality to really elevate to a KPI that we can also measure, for instance, through the corporate sustainability assessment, we will move in that direction. So we've seen, for instance, with single-use plastics, that we started with research and we're now bringing that into a broader set of questions for all of the companies. And this is sort of a maturation of how ESG topics initially get detailed research and then finally get into a broad measurement framework.
Sachi, with the upcoming fire season in the Amazon, which might be even more dramatic than in 2019 due to Bolsonaro's policies and high Chinese meat and soy demand, what are your steps, or Hermes steps, in engagement before things go wrong? Because you respond mainly to requests by investors, but are they asking you about this potential environmental disaster?
Yeah, so we on the topic of soy and cattle deforestation, we have been engaging on this topic through particularly with the PRI group. I'm sure Peter is also on the same committee, and so we have actively engaging with the company, and we jointly published a statement last year when the height of the Amazon fire. But more broadly about how to prepare and prevent these things. So we do have largely, I think, the two kinds of types of engagement, and the one is reactive and the one is more proactive. And reactive, as the name suggests, that when something happens, we start to engage when major scandal, corporate scandal, or high-profile NGO allegations are reported. Then we start engaging on that specific topics, and sometimes with companies that we hadn't previously engaged. But we try to focus, and then we do focus more on proactive engagement, and we try to be ahead of the curve, if you like. We try to predict what might come next. But I think that for that reason, I think it's quite important to get the governance and the board structure right, and that's another reason that I think EOS has always been quite heavy on the governance engagement. And if we think it's not saying environmental and social issues are any less important, but to be able to manage those wider risks, and also for the board to be able to foresee these risks and then prepare for those challenges. It's very important to have right skill sets and diverse skill sets on the board and the correct oversight. So we do focus on that sort of thing, and then prepare for crisis.
Thank you. Jaswant has a question for you, Peter, again on the agricultural space. Pursuing certain activities could have mixed results in terms of ESG impact. For example, livestock and agriculture could address hunger, but could also release methane. How do you measure impact in these type of scenarios?
Yeah, that's a very important dilemma. So at Robeco, we've developed a sustainable development goal framework to assess the impact of sort of the products and services of companies we invest in, next to their, let's say, more business operations and business conduct that we historically have also always measured. And there we really look at these competing positive and negative impacts, and how to account for those when you look at the livestock industry. So livestock provides food, provides also economic opportunities for a lot of smaller farmers that are part of this broader supply chain, but at the same time has a huge climate change impact through methane, but even more so through indirect land use change, through deforestation, when it comes to production of soy and other products that are used as animal feed. So from that perspective, we see the production of meat actually as a higher risk product when it comes to its climate change impact, and that's also what we then discuss with retailers when it comes to their product portfolio and sort of scope 3 for their for their operations, when it comes to also working with sustainable protein products. So there is a lot of these angles that we bring together. And it really helps to use the SDGs as a clear measurement framework to see where does it create a positive and a negative impact, and ultimately do we assess the overall impact as positive or negative for companies. So we've developed a 7-point scale, and we've also have now investment products that actually invest only in the positive companies that really have a +2 or a +3, or we're now also looking at products that are really investing in companies that are in the transition, and how can we move them up in that ranking to really become more SDG positive companies. And I think that's where, it's very important to have sufficient quality of research to be able to make that assessment in terms of where does a company lie on that scale, and how can we get them on that transition.
Thank you. Sachi, I have a question from Alessandro. As an investor, I realize that many ESG funds are investing in companies that don't see to be really focused on promoting sustainability. What would you recommend me to help me find authentic, purpose-driven ESG fund managers, as opposed to tick the box greenwashing ESG fund managers other than Hermes, Robeco's, and the other companies that are giving you a finder's fee?
Yes, I think it's a tricky one, and there are many methods of ESG investment. You probably know that some, we take engagement methods, but we do have integration with our in-house fund. So we sometimes sit together in a meeting, then do the same, they share the meeting with a company, but sometimes we just exchange information and do feedback. But other investors may do positive, negative screening, and then they use scoring, which obviously we also use internally in one of the funds. They quantify ESG performance and combined with some narrative performance. So I suppose you can look at how exactly those investors integrate ESG. How exactly they do it? Do they have dedicated ESG analysts, and do they work together with the fund managers properly, and how often do they meet? Is the investment ESG team just there, as you say, doing a kind of cosmetic service, or do they have a proper procedures for integration? And you can even see what how their performance has been. But I guess looking at performance can be tricky sometimes, because ESG issues are of long-term nature, and it's not always easy to see the immediate results on share price.
Thank you. We've gone beyond the time that we promised that we would stick to, so I'm going to have to wrap up. Alessandro, I'll have to owe you that question for another time. I want to thank very, very much Sachi Suzuki from Hermes and Peter from the Werf. If you have any more questions, you can find them on LinkedIn, and they're happy to address any issues. There's a very long list of people who worked on this program, and I want to thank them all right now. I want to particularly thank Sam, our webinars producer and ambient DJ, Ricky, our cooking machine and absolute better half, Donnie Trump, our suntanning and makeup advisor, Xi Jinping, head of transparency and integrity, Jair Bolsonaro, director of forest conservation, Kellyanne Conway, in charge of alternative facts department, Boris Johnson, our hairstylist, Vladimir Putin, conflict resolution supervisor, Joe Biden, mental health coach, and Rodrigo Duterte, our recreational drugs mentor. See you next week.